Thank you everyone for joining us today at this webinar for the Food Date Labeling Act. Really appreciate you all joining us. My name is Katie Marchini and I'm the COO at Replate. We're a food rescue organization based out of the San Francisco Bay Area, but we work nationally. And so obviously food waste is very important to us. And so date labeling is also very important to us. And we'll get more into the connection between those two in a bit. But first, I want to introduce Danielle Melgar, who is the food advocate over at PIRG, and have her do a brief introduction.
Hi, I run the Food and Agriculture Program with the Public Interest Research Group. We are a national nonprofit organization with affiliates in 30 states across the country. We have members in every congressional district supporting our work that is completely nonpartisan, working to address the biggest public health, consumer, and environmental threats that our country faces.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Danielle. And this is our first co-hosted event between PIRG and Replate, so this is really exciting. And we have a great group of panelists today. First, we have Andrea Collins, who's Senior Specialist of Sustainable Food Systems at the NRDC. We have Tori Otto, who's Clinical Fellow at Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic, and Regina Anderson, who is Executive Director at the Food Recovery Network. So great group here today who all have different expertise and are going to bring some nuance to this topic. So we are first I'm going to level set everyone and kind of give an introduction to date labeling in the US and the Food Date Labeling Act, and then we'll go into more detail with our panelists. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A at the bottom, and we'll try to get to that in the last 10 minutes or so of the discussion, depending on how many questions there are. And if you have to drop out early and you're unable to see the entire webinar, we will be posting a recording on YouTube and also on PIRG's website. So it'll be in multiple places, and we'll also be following up with an email. So you can't get away from us. So without further ado, I will get into it. Food date labeling, you might be wondering, why are we talking about this? Don't we already have food date labeling in the United States? Which is true, we do have food date labeling. But it is not federally regulated currently. So that means that each state is dealing with date labeling on their own. And this brings up a lot of different complications. But first, I'm going to do a little demonstration. I should say, actually, the only food that is currently federally regulated around having a date label is infant formula, which is very important. Obviously, at the very least, we want formula to be regulated, but we would also like those regulations to apply to other foods as well. So I'm going to give you a quick demonstration of some items that are in my pantry just to show you how unclear the date labeling situation currently is. So we've got right here something that says best if used by, and it has a very specific date. It says September 25th, 2025. So giving a very specific date. We have a can here that has some numbers at the top, but it is not a best by or a sell by. It might be some sort of manufacturing code, but it would require a Google to figure out what that means. So I have no idea how old these are or when they should be tossed for safety reasons and when they might not taste as good for quality reasons. And then we have just a regular best by date, a best before date that has, a date, the month and the year, and then something that's just stamped with a date. There's no sell by, there's no expiration. There's nothing that tells me what this date is. The only thing I know is it's not a manufacturing date because the date is sometime in the future. And then we have our classic sell by date, which is very useful for grocery stores, but not useful for me as the consumer because I have no idea how long that this is good to eat after that sell by date. Is it a month? Is it a few weeks? Is it 6 months? Very unclear. So all of this is just to say that right now, things are quite convoluted, and this act would help to clear that up. So the first and main thing that this act would do is create two types of labels. So the first one would be a quality label, and so that would be a best if used by label. So anytime you saw best if used by, that would just be an indication of quality. And then there would be a safety label, which would be a use by label, and that would be a date that actually implied that you should not eat this after the date. So for example, if you had Cheerios and it said best if used by today, March 21st, 2024, you could reasonably assume that it was safe to feed your children a few weeks from now. It's just a quality issue. There's no safety issue with them continuing to eat it. However, if it was chicken and it had a use by date, that would mean, okay, this is a safety issue, toss this after this date, you shouldn't be consuming this anymore. The last thing that it would do is also encourage manufacturers to add a freeze by date, which would hopefully reduce food waste by kind of nudging consumers and informing them that, you don't have to just throw this out. You could also freeze it and use it at another time if you're not able to get to it. The other thing that it would do is instruct the FDA and USDA to educate consumers and food industry about the new date labels if this were to pass. And that's super important because, as we're talking about right now, there's a lot of confusion already about date labels. Most people assume currently that the date labels mean something when they, in fact, do not. And also, it would eliminate state laws that bar the donation of food past the quality date. So currently, in states such as Montana and Kentucky, if you have dairy products that are past the sell by date, you cannot sell them and you cannot donate them. And as many of you might know, like in my own fridge currently, I have, sour cream and yogurt that is well past the sell by date, but is still perfectly edible. But in Montana and Kentucky, they would not have been able to sell that at that point. They wouldn't have been able to give it to anyone and it would have gone to waste. And this is upsetting for multiple reasons. One, because that's perfectly edible food that's being thrown to landfill, but also because dairy products in particular are really resource intensive, requiring not only a lot of water, but also a lot of land for cattle. And so it's not only the food being wasted, but also all of that resources that went into creating those dairy products. So this would kind of help force these states into, they could still bar grocery stores from selling something if it had a safety date on it, a use by date. But if it was just a quality date, then those grocery stores would still be able to sell that. So consumers, Shelley Pingree, who is one of the senators that introduced this legislation, called this a domestic harmony problem, which I thought was really funny and resonated with me because within my own family, the best by date on food is often a source of contention. So when I see this can that says best before October 2024, if it's January of 2025, I'm going to still say that this is edible, right? Because I see that this can, it doesn't have any dents on it. There's no rust. There's nothing that says or shows that this has been compromised and now is unsafe to use. But my partner, who does not work in the food industry, would look at this date and see this as the authority and be afraid that if he ate it after this point, that he would get sick. And so on a consumer level, there is a lot of, day-to-day things being thrown out just to reduce conflict within the household because one person says that something's safe to eat and the other person says that it's not. So in addition to like this industry-wide reduction in food waste by being able to donate items that previously in some states weren't donatable, it would also help on the consumer level of creating some understanding at a household level that, what dates mean. This best by date, that's a quality issue. A use by date, not so much. So with that, we are going to get into it. I'm going to pass it off to Tori. Tori, can you just give us a brief introduction about what you do and how it relates to the Food Date Labeling Act?
Hi, so I'm Tori. I am an attorney and a fellow with the Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic out of the law school. For a little bit of context about what the clinic does, we work with partner organizations, communities on a number of different food system issues, though my portfolio in particular focuses on, food waste policy at the federal, state, and local level. We kind of address all the issues that are at the intersection between law and policy when it comes to our food system, kind of, identifying some of those unique opportunities to address, inefficiencies in the legal system and the food system, to address kind of food loss and waste. And I'd say, date labels and the Food Date Labeling Act in particular is one of those key common sense solutions that's just about kind of getting the regulatory system kind of in line with, how consumers operate, how they look at their food products and how they make those like purchasing and consumption decisions. And, kind of my approach to, food law and policy is all about how can we make it easier for consumers to waste less food in their home. I'm, steering away from any consumer blame when it comes to law and regulation and, kind of focusing more on how can we get industry to make it easier for consumers to eat more of the food that they buy, and how can we kind of just support consumers in making those decisions in their homes. So thanks.
Awesome. I'm going to pass it off to Andrea if you can do the same and just give us a brief introduction.
And be happy to. My name is Andrea Collins with the Natural Resources Defense Council, and NRDC is an environmental organization. We work to improve air quality, to modernize the transportation system, to protect wild places. And when we first started working on food and agriculture, we were helping farmers to better utilize the resources, the natural resources, more efficiently by monitoring water usage or fertilizer inputs. And when we learned that about 40% of the food in the United States is never eaten, we realized that we would never be able to get to a sustainable system without addressing the sources of food waste. You can't only look at how farmers can be more efficient, you have to look downstream at where food is going and ways that we can make sure that we're utilizing the food that is being produced and procured in our country. And when you look at the climate benefits of reducing food waste, you find that preventing food from ever becoming waste in the first place is much more environmentally preferable than any other ways of ensuring that food doesn't go to a landfill like composting or anaerobic digestion. Because of all of the embedded resources that go into growing, cooling, transporting, all of the steps along the food supply chain that get our food to our refrigerators. And households account for about 40 to 50% of all of the food waste that's happening in our country. And when you think about all of those steps that also went into getting it through other parts of the food supply chain, there's a lot more embedded resources to the food that's in our household. So household food waste is one of those key places where we should look for interventions to look for a more sustainable food system for all of the environmental reasons, including the climate impacts of our food system. And it turns out that about 20% of household food waste is due to confusion over these date labels. It's an enormous opportunity for us to really be looking at not only one place where households have some control over their own activities, but also looking at the system as a whole and ways that we can help ensure that our food system is more sustainable and ensuring that our food is being utilized much better. So Food Date Labeling Act is a clear place for us to look into both the environmental wins as well as the social and the economic opportunities for addressing food waste, both for the benefit of people's health, for the climate, for biodiversity, nature, all of the environmental impacts that our food system has. And so this is one of the key places that we see a great opportunity to address right now.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that, Andrea. Regina, can you do a brief intro?
Would love to. Hi, everyone. My name is Regina Anderson Harmon. I was recently married, so I'm in the process of changing my last name to Harmon. So I have to say, so I'm the executive director of Food Recovery Network. And before I give an overview of Food Recovery Network, or FRN for short, I did want to say I'm currently in Chicago. I am attending a gathering on understanding, measuring, and addressing racism in the food system. And so I just wanted to give everyone that context to this conversation that we're having today around, the 44 million people who are food insecure and the systems that perpetuate that, and how this conversation is a wonderful move in the right direction for widening access to food. I am in Chicago, so I am on the land of the Council of Three Fires. So with respect, I might mispronounce the names of the Ojibwe, Odawa, and the Potawatomi tribes that are here. Another part of this conversation around food access, when we think about our Native peoples and the deep knowledge that they have in how to be stewards of our land for our natural companions, our four-legged friends, the little insect life, all of that. So I thank the Fire of the Food Council for that. And also, I'm wearing my James Baldwin t-shirt. Some more, on that. We are celebrating the 100th birthday in February of James Baldwin. So just wanted to bring all that context and that space and that energy into, the comments that I have for all of you, with love and with respect. Food Recovery Network, we were started in 2011 by college students at the University of Maryland who saw two things happening. On their college campus, a lot of food was going to waste that was still perfectly good. At 4:58, that food was good to purchase. And at 5:01 p.m., that food would get thrown away. So that seemed really silly to the students, the co-founders of Food Recovery Network, who knew because of their volunteering in their communities that people were experiencing hunger. We can call it food insecurity, that's definitely a thing, but at the end of the day, people are going to bed with empty bellies. And then at the same time, so this was 2011, we are in a different space today, unfortunately in the wrong directionality, that when we throw food away, as Andrea mentioned, as Tori mentioned, as Katie's mentioned, when we throw food away, we're harming our environment. So we have moved from when I was growing up to this thing called climate change. We've moved into then climate emergency, to now, climate crisis. When we throw our food away, not only are we taking that resource away from people who need it and deserve it, but we are also directly harming our natural lived environment, our planet Earth. And so that's why we started Food Recovery Network. To this day, we've recovered over 17 million pounds of food, 1 carload of food at a time, through the power of college students, the power of people who want to encourage and lead with empathy. People deserve food. We can do better for our environment. And so we mostly, our food recovery efforts are at the farm field through commercial institutional settings, but the Date Labeling Act is so critical for all of us for the reasons that I'm really excited to talk with all of you about. So thank you, Katie.
Awesome. Thanks, Regina. Appreciate that. And also, sorry, I keep forgetting. I met Regina before she was married. So Regina Anderson is always going to be stuck in my head when I go look for you in my email inbox. That's always going to be what I type. Great. So next thing we're going to get into is kind of the primary objectives of the Food Date Labeling Act. So Tori or Andrea, if you kind of want to help give us a brief overview. I know I went into it a little bit, but if we can kind of go through it again and kind of how you foresee it impacting food waste reduction efforts nationally.
Yeah, sure. And yeah, I think you got, at the top of this webinar, you kind of went through it all, but it can't hurt to kind of mention it again because I know it can be complicated a little bit. So I think the core of the Food Date Labeling Act is essentially saying, if you choose to put a date label on your food product, you have to choose one of two phrases. You either choose the phrase, best if used by, and that's if you're trying to indicate this is about quality. This is when it's going to reach peak quality, after which, use your own senses to determine when it's no longer safe to eat. And then the other phrase that you could use is used by. And that's if you're indicating, okay, after this date, really, the assumption that you should be throwing it away, that aligns, kind of, you should be discarding it. And so it's taking, all the 60 different phrases that we see on our shelves, some of which, Katie, you had kind of gone through, the ones that you see on your own shelf, and it's distilling it down to just those two. And the other key piece of it too is that it allows for, businesses to sell and donate their food products past the quality date. Because if, best if used by, it's not going to be communicating that safety piece of it. It's safe for all of us to be consuming in our homes. We should still be allowed to sell it, to donate it, and just make sure it's getting to people. And then the last key piece of it that I'd like to mention too is that consumer education piece that you went through, which is directing the FDA and USDA to educate consumers about the meaning of date labels. And then that'll just continue to kind of enhance on the pre-existing efforts that are out there, like this one, or like kind of any other webinars, what the private sector is doing, what advocacy groups are doing out there to educate consumers about the meaning of date labels. They'll all just have a lot easier of a time kind of saying what date labels mean consistently. To speak to your other kind of question too about, what is the potential for impact? What's the kind of primary objective? I'll just, go over again the fact that 10% of all food waste in the United States comes from this consumer confusion around date labels. And that's, not just in our households where it's an even bigger percentage of all the food waste associated with households, but it's also, in the supply chain, in retail, not understanding, at the end of the day, the people who are handling our food are also consumers. And so when they're confused in the retail setting or in the manufacturing setting, they're also kind of wasting that food, or in our restaurants as well. And so, kind of the Food Date Labeling Act is really getting at that 10% of all food waste piece of it. And then I'll also mention, there was a recent op-ed by Frank Yanis, who's the former deputy commissioner for food policy and response at FDA. And that op-ed really made the connection that, the 10% of all food waste piece, that's about 1.3 billion meals every year. So that's a quarter of all the meals that Feeding America, like food banks, distributed in 2022. And that's just like unreal in terms of, in our own homes, the amount of food that we're able to kind of recover back, and just kind of across the board. And then the last piece of it too that I'll mention is that, the FDLA, it has no cost to the federal government to pass. And so it's one of those most cost-effective solutions to address food loss and waste. And the actual biggest impact that we'll see is actually in our own homes and in households to be able to kind of stretch our food dollars further. So that's kind of the overview that I have, but Andrea, yeah, feel free to fill any gaps that I might have left behind.
I think between you and Katie's original description, we've covered a lot, but I do want to put a finer point on this idea that so many people are throwing away food prematurely because they're worried it's going to make them sick. And this is a pervasive view that's mostly not founded on anything. And so this is problematic because right now our date labels don't have any meaning. There's no way for us to determine which ones are those quality dates, which most of them are quality dates, but there are a few that are safety dates, and that we need to be paying attention to how long an item is sitting in our refrigerator before it's going to have proliferation of bacteria that could potentially make us sick. It's a small number of items, but we really do need to have this clarity of which ones deserve a use by date so that we can make sure we're consuming them before we get to that point, or freezing them, as Katie mentioned, is a good way for us to be conserving food. And so I think that having this clarity will put more information that consumers are really looking for that will then help us to be able to utilize the food that we have, rather than having to guess as to what the meaning is behind these labels. And when we're not tossing all of that food because we're unsure, that's going to help us be able to utilize our food much better. It'll be able to help stretch our food budgets to be able to ensure that everyone is using the food that they've already procured, and be able to have like a dignity of understanding of when our food is at peak quality compared to when it might actually make us sick, especially for those people who have health concerns where they can't afford to get a foodborne illness or any other reason why they might be able to have this uncertainty and this distrust of our food system. And so I do think that this is one of those places where having that information and knowing that there is actual real meaning behind these date labels is one of the key solutions that's then going to help the rest of our attempts to really connect people to their food, so that we really value the food that we have and don't waste food because we misunderstand what is trying to be relayed to us.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Andrea. I was also wondering if you could expand a little bit on what role the legislation would play in educating consumers. I know, Tori, you said that this is like a bill that wouldn't cost anything to implement, but I do understand that there is like an education component that the USDA and FDA would need to do. So just wondering if there's any more understanding of what that would look like, or how that might have been done for previous bills in the past, anything that you could give us to illuminate on?
I think that education piece is really key to a lot of the success of this bill. And so it's great to have the agencies being able or being required to include some education component that's written into the law. And there's a lot of academic research around how date labels are interpreted now and how people are interacting with date labels. So there's a study by Ronnie Nett's team and that they found that 84% of consumers discard food that's near the packaging date. It's a huge problem across our country, and it's far too many of us tossing good food prematurely. And there's another study by a group called MITRE that reinforced that food date labels are a problem because they found that people who often or always throw away food that's past date are wasting twice as much food as people who don't pay attention to the date label. This is one of those key places where we can really address our national problem by fixing this one confusing element of our food system. And there's two problems at play here. One is that people are confused about what the dates mean. And the second one is that the dates are confusing. So we need to fix the dates first. And then we need USDA, FDA, retailers, lots of food brands are interested in talking to their customers about this issue. Cities are engaging residents about other aspects of sustainability. This is a key opportunity that could be integrated. There's NGOs like mine who could step into this space. We previously ran a consumer-facing campaign called Save the Food, where we would love to educate consumers about this issue, but we couldn't because there's no standardized description of what to do with these dates. So once we have streamlined dates, we'll have a great opportunity for all of these folks within this food space to be able to educate on the meaning of the date labels and what we should be doing with our food.
Yeah, that's a really good point that these outside groups can't even do the education right now because there's nothing to educate on. It's too complex to even try to explain the system or lack of system that we have right now. Tori, it looked like you wanted to say something.
Yeah, no, that made me think of something as well, and I'll just add that, the FDA and the USDA, they're really primed and ready to go for like starting this national education campaign, including date labels. I don't know if those of you, if you're like kind of working in this food waste space, saw the draft national strategy on food loss and waste and recycling organics, I think was the full long name of this strategy. But they had identified that they're planning to do a big consumer education push around food loss and waste. And so if we're able to kind of standardize date labels before all that happens, it'll kind of enhance all those efforts kind of Andrea was speaking to too.
Nice. Okay, so yeah, dovetailed together with what they're already working on. Also, Tori, could you give us a little more explanation about how we ended up here and why date labeling is currently so all over the place?
Yeah, sure. So you had mentioned, that we don't have any federal regulation of date labels except for infant formula. And that's true. And so what that means is that it's really left to the states to address how they choose to regulate date labels within their jurisdiction. And naturally, this has just led to a complete patchwork of date label rules, laws, guidance, kind of across the board. So you might be selling, one product in Kansas and then that same product in Florida. And depending on your product, you might have to comply with completely different date label rules. So, one example that we heard earlier this week too is like, a lot of these bigger food businesses, they might have one big warehouse in one state or one big manufacturing plant in one state. And that is the hub from which they send out all their food products across the United States. And so it's just like, if they're sending it to all these different jurisdictions that have different rules and regulations, they have to kind of change their system, and it just makes it more complicated for them as well to kind of comply with all these different regulatory structures. And then the other thing I'll add too about this state patchwork piece is that usually, there are some states that have no rules at all for date labels, and so it's completely left to manufacturer discretion. And then even in those states that do have some sort of regulation, it's really usually limited to a small number of products. So something like, a popular one we see is shellfish or dairy or maybe eggs or something like that will have more specific rules. Where, yeah, so kind of having this patchwork, makes it confusing, but it's also, if we do have this federal date labeling solution come in, it's not really going to be kind of infringing on the state power piece of it, because they've only addressed date labels within their jurisdictions to a really small amount. There are a few states out there who are thinking about kind of taking on this more standardized scheme. Like California is a great example where they've introduced this piece of legislation that would implement this same dual structure that the FDLA has. But we're just kind of hearing, over and over, it would be so much easier rather than kind of sticking to this patchwork solution to kind of have just one standardized solution out of the federal government.
Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like, when you have, so ReFed has a website where you can go and look at the different policies for each and every state. And the fact that that even has to exist because it's so complicated, and it's something I'm sure, Regina, you've used it as well. Like at food recovery organizations, we're using it because we work across state lines to look and see, okay, can they donate this item even though it's past the best by date? And it's just, yeah, it's very convoluted right now. Regina, can you tell us a little bit about how this act would improve public understanding of food safety?
Would love to. And, I just wanted to sort of bring back into, I think what Tori said, sorry if this wasn't Tori, but just the sheer amount of food that we are producing in the United States and just not consuming, maybe it was Andrea, that this kind of legislation would ensure at the home level, yes, that we are keeping more of our food that we have purchased in our homes, that we know will be safe to eat for us. And I just wanted to give a little bit of context to that, because when we think about the narratives and we think about storytelling, there's, as philosopher Kendrick Lamar will tell us, there's different levels to it, and you and I know. When we think about some of the homes in the United States, they are in a place where they don't even have extra food to determine whether or not, hey, let's toss this because of the date label tells us we should do that. They just don't have food. And then when we go kind of into other homes across the United States, this might feel more familiar to some of you here, which is we are putting back the blackberries because they're not quite in our budget right now. Or we are, saying no to that, name brand XYZ product because it might not be in our budget right now. But maybe it didn't seem that way a couple of years ago. We've done a lot of data research at Food Recovery Network, and the understanding is the narrative of like who is struggling in the United States. It's actually closer to many of us who are on this call today. It is not just the quote unquote down and out, the unhoused, the housing insecure, but it is a lot of families that people are working multiple jobs. They have kids. They're doing everything right. And so it is those homes as well that the confusion that would prompt someone to throw something away, we feel it a bit more. And so this new legislation, when it passes, will ensure that more of us can keep that food in our homes. We're not necessarily, like I was saying, at the very bottom of the economic scale, but what we're seeing data-wise is that there's a wide gap between the poverty line and living wage, that most people in the United States, most families are not making a living wage. And so these kinds of decisions can really matter. And then in terms of, what this can mean for organizations like mine and for Amazing Food Banks, for Replate, the folks on the front lines, making sure that our communities have access to food in the form of donated product, that we are now not only able to capture more of that food because food banks that might have had to turn away, those precious bags of spinach because of a confusing date label, we can actually bring that food to these locations. But it also means the recipient of that food is receiving food with dignity. And so I think that's also a really important component to all of this as well. There are so many wins. How, win, 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 all over the place with a piece of legislation like this. And, someone said it before, this literally is that common sense. And, Katie, I know, we might talk about this in a little bit, but industry is, signaling that this is something. And when I say industry, and it's a fancy way, I guess, of saying like grocery stores and food distribution companies, those that have access to these massive quantities of food, are signaling like, yeah, this is something that they can get behind for a lot of the right reasons.
Yeah, and to get into that a little bit more, Tori and Andrea, whoever wants to talk about this one, we know that there had been a little bit of pushback from some industry, but mostly it seemed like there was overwhelming support. So could either of you give a little bit of insight into what's going on there?
Yeah, happy to. And I'll say, this has come up in some of the work we've been doing around the Food Date Labeling Act through the Zero Food Waste Coalition, which is, co-founded by 4 organizations, 2 of which is, the Food Law and Policy Clinic and then NRDC. And, something that we were hearing over and over from particularly members of Congress, Republican members of Congress, was, what is industry thinking about this? Because in the past, when the Food Date Labeling Act was introduced, there were a couple of big industry names who came out publicly against it because, it would be difficult for them to implement or something like that, or it just required some change. And I think over time, there have been a number of different conversations, there's been more state efforts, and I think they're, kind of getting on board that the federal solution is going to be actually ultimately a lot easier for them to implement than doing this kind of continued state patchwork. Because like I said earlier, states are interested in trying to make it easier for their own constituents, I guess, to know what date labels mean. And so rather than having that kind of state by state solution, again, the federal solution is a lot easier. So kind of in response to hearing that, we went out and we were speaking to a number of different industry members, brands, retailers, et cetera, to hear kind of what their concerns are. And we actually have a sign-on letter that we sent to the Hill, the main committees on the Hill, about showing this industry support for the Food Date Labeling Act. And that includes signatories like Whole Foods, Amazon, Kroger, Danone, Nestle. And the messaging that we kind of got back for the large majority of these conversations was that, again, it's addressing that state patchwork that I spoke to. It actually is pretty easy for them to implement. It's just switching the phrase ahead of their actual date that they chose. It's still voluntary, so we're not saying you have to include a date label, and we're not saying that, you have to choose a particular date. Like, that's still left to the manufacturer's discretion. And so they have 2 years essentially just to like hit a different button on their I don't know, technology, their machines, however that works. And so it was easy enough for them to kind of get on board and make that change. And then the last thing we heard too was that, at the end of the day, a lot of these brands are also just trying to communicate with their consumers. They are putting something like best if used by on their food product because they think that it's helpful to the consumer. And so if we're able to reduce that consumer confusion, just have 2 phrases, they're also able to more effectively and consistently communicate to their customers, when is this product going to reach peak quality, and are there safety concerns that their consumers should be thinking about? And so that way too, their consumers are actually going to be eating more of the food product that they're purchasing from them rather than throwing it away.
Which we love to see. I just wanted to throw this kind of to all of you in general, which is, why should consumers care about this issue? I feel like it's something, that touches each and every one of us in our daily lives, but getting people to actually engage in what's going on from a policy perspective can be rather difficult, even when it's something that affects them. So it's just, I would love to hear from each of you kind of your perspective on why consumers should care about this.
I would love to start with that. I mean, um, consumers should care because it is their money. It is their hard-earned money that is the victim, in all of this when we toss away food that we could be eating just because we're confused. And so from a policy standpoint, I think the other reason why consumers should care, not only does it support your family budget, but also this is something, as was just said, there's a lot of momentum around this. And we saw that kind of momentum with the the Food Donation Improvement Act in January 2023. That, our Congress can act. They can do things, and we can celebrate, and we can, be the vision that we want in the world. And so this is one of those policies that, everyone is just kind of like, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. So I would say for people who aren't used to policy, who think maybe their vote doesn't matter, or talking to their elected official, whether that is their state rep or their senators, this is something really kind of, food touches all of us. So this is something that we can speak from the heart, and chances are we're going to get a win on this, so try it out, get in there, so I think that's another reason why consumers should care. But then back to what I was saying before, 44 million people right now are food insecure. During the height of COVID, it was 54 million. Before COVID, it was 38 million. We were all born into people being food insecure, all of us, across presidencies, across administrations. We should care because this is, again, expanding all of our humanity, keeping us closer connected to our humanity, by ensuring that all that beautiful food that our farmers are growing, the farmhands are harvesting, continues to keep its value. This is the reason why we should all really care about what is happening to our precious food, that we're eating it and that we're not harming Mother Earth. Because the number one place that all this food is going to go, it's not going to be fed to animals. It's not going to go into anaerobic digestion to make energy. It's not going to be composted. Those things do happen. But the number one place that it's going to go is into landfill, where it is going to directly harm our environment. And we have the power to really dramatically reduce that.
Thanks, Regina. Appreciate that. Andrea?
Sure. On top of everything that Regina has just said, I think that there's a couple of additional components that other folks might respond to around that marital harmony aspect that Shelley Pingree talks about, and that Katie, you mentioned at the front around this really is a transparency issue. We really should all care about getting the information that we need from food manufacturers, and that the fact that this is so confusing to people is one that I think we can all get behind, understanding what manufacturers are trying to relay to us. And beyond that, there's really an opportunity here for us all to be engaging more around talking about our food and valuing our food. And this is one of those key places where we all think that the government is already regulating these states, which is not happening. And so this is a chance for our expectations to be matching with reality.
Awesome. Thanks for that. Tori?
I love both of those. I love, Andrea and Regina, what you both said about, transparency. It's our own food dollars, and just kind of having control over the food that we're eating and what we're seeing from industry. Something I'll add in, which is I think a little underrated too, is we live in such a partisan country right now, which can be really depressing when you're reading the news. And like, what I love about working in food waste and what we see on date labeling is that this is such a bipartisan issue. Everyone can get behind, the fact that we should be actually consuming the food that we're growing. It's in support of, it's in support of our producers. It's in support of agriculture. It supports industry. It supports consumers and food insecurity. It's just like something that everyone can kind of rally behind. And so I think getting this significant win would be, something we can all kind of celebrate.
Definitely. We're going to transition to some questions from the audience really quick. And one of those is, Were these phrases tested with focus groups to ensure they are clear for consumers? I have seen some studies that people still think Best By is a safety date. Could there be a phrase that says peak freshness at?
I'm
I'll start it and then Tori, you can add on.
Yeah.
But the study that I referenced earlier from Johns Hopkins about how many people are wasting food based on the date labels also looked at these date phrases. And they found that these phrases are ones that are most commonly understood to connect with the meanings that they have. Whereas peak freshness at was one that did not relay as much meaning for people. So I'm happy to drop the link to that article if that's of interest. I'd also say that these are voluntary dates that many industry manufacturers started to adopt many years ago and have been in circulation for a while. And so they're voluntary is a problem in and of itself, but that has led to additional kind of buy into these specific phrases and has helped a little bit in the meaning of what they might be trying to relay that we can then build on in the future. Tori, did you have something else you wanted to add?
Yeah, I'll add just a little bit of context too of like why these two phrases, I guess, which is I think back when this legislation was being drafted, I think it was Walmart and then along with, our organization, the Food Law and Policy Clinic, had done this study of, okay, looking at all the most common phrases, what do consumers already kind of associate with the term like used by, best if used by, etc. And what we found was that used by was the phrase that consumers already associated with food safety. And so that was like an easy, okay, industry was also supportive of that phrase. So that was selected. And then the other term, best if used by, I think was technically second in terms of communicating to consumers this is about quality and not about safety. But the reason that, I think that it was chosen was that, like Andrea was saying, there were already a couple of voluntary initiatives out there that were using the term best if used by. And so we were able to kind of get that compromise and support in terms of here's what's going to be effective and here's what industry is also going to be supportive of and therefore, more likely to get it to pass at the end of the day. And so, those voluntary initiatives too, in case you're curious, the organizations that were in support of it were FMI, so that's the Food Industry Association, Consumer Goods Forum, and then also the Consumer Brands Association.
Awesome. Really appreciate that context from both of you. Another question is there pushback from manufacturers around liability around potential illness? They may prefer to have a short quality or safety date.
I'm happy to speak to this one too.
Go for it, Tori.
This has been something, people are curious about this question too on liability, and this is a question we get from staffers. Like, do we hear this at all from the manufacturers that we speak to? And we've actually yet to have a member of industry kind of raise it to us. And then our partner Walmart too, when they voluntarily had all of their brands adapt to this best if used by date, it actually led to a longer shelf life for their products. So it didn't this concern didn't really come to fruition about whether liability would be impacted. And then, kind of diving into the liability piece of it, which is that in the United States, we already have a strict liability scheme when it comes to our food products. And so what that means is that if you sell a food product and it's gonna, it gets someone sick at the end of the day, you're gonna be liable kind of no matter what. And so it's not really gonna change your liability whether you used a certain phrase or whether you used like a certain date or something like that. Because at the end of the day, if it gets someone sick, you're gonna be liable.
Yeah, I also think that ties back to the things that people are likely to get sick from. There's already some sort of contamination. It has little to do with how long it's been sitting. Like it was a problem at the very beginning. Andrea, did you want to hop in there?
Yeah, we've asked manufacturers this question around how they would change their dates depending on what legislation was out there. And the response we've gotten so far is that it doesn't make sense for them to short the dates because that then puts the onus back on them in terms of keeping their food on shelves longer, it's going to lead to more waste for them. And so shortening a date simply to comply with FDLA, it doesn't make business sense. It would increase waste on their end, and they don't want that because it's not an economically feasible option. And so there hasn't been pushback from this from manufacturers because it just doesn't make financial sense.
Awesome. Thanks. I appreciate that. Also, Regina, there's some curiosity about what conference you're at in Chicago.
Yes, thanks so much. And I was gonna say too, like just in terms of liability, on our end, I know we work a lot with like again the other side of things, and liability is real. These are feelings, and feelings are valid, and but again, at the end of the day, it is about all the things that Tori and Andrea just said. And at the end of the day, if there's a store or location that is hesitant to donate their food, please put them in touch with me. I would love to talk with them about, how we can help you work through those feelings. But anyway, yes, the conference that I'm at is it is brought together by a consulting group called Impact and supported by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. It's about 240 people all across the United States, including our Native community and Black and Brown communities, to discuss all kinds of different topics around the food system, including liberation of our food communities. We had a really wonderful conversation about this idea of what is a food desert, and truly leaning into those uncomfortable spaces of some people were really very much against that term. We had a lot of conversation around food sovereignty and what that can look like. We had a large conversation around corporations and the kinds of foods that we have access to, and why some foods are very subsidized and therefore very cheap, but very unhealthy for us and driving diabetes. And we talked a lot about philanthropic liberation, trusting organizations such as all of ours with the funding that we do receive to ensure that we can accomplish our missions. Thanks for that.
Yeah, thanks, Regina. Great. So I know this is slightly off topic, but related since it did come up in this, which is, are there any updates on the Food Donation Improvement Act and how it's going, and any impact it's had now that it's been in law for more than a year? Tori or Andrea, any comments on that?
And I can just say real quick for us, okay, it's from our perspective. Again, we are going to all over the United States. Our student leaders are having conversations with folks that are the decision makers, that we now feel more like we've grown our power in terms of the Food Donation Improvement Act, that we can feel assured that we have this piece of legislation again, to work through the feelings that people might have about, I just don't want to get sued. We have to walk through those. So that has helped us, be a bit more on the ground with churning some, no, I don't want to donate that food, into it, yes, we will donate that food.
Love to hear that. Like that's such a pain point. Yeah, go ahead.
This is one of those places where once a law is enacted, the education piece around it is so critical, and why I'm so glad that FDLA includes a piece that requires education. I think we still have a little ways to go in terms of ensuring that everybody understands both the provisions in FDIA as well as the original Good Samaritan provisions. As Regina's mentioned already, like, liability concerns are still present, and this is one of those places where we need a lot more education. So some of my colleagues have been working to help spread the word about how FDIA provides liability protections. And we've created some short videos to help businesses understand and explain both the original Good Samaritan Act and the additional protection. So I'm happy to put the link in there. Please share the videos with anyone you think might be of interest to these. They feature Tom Colicchio. They're really cute. There's my favorite one is about grandma, so go find that one.
Oh, love that. Yeah, I think it's so important. That education piece is so important. And as Regina said, I mean, even in California, where now it's required for most food generators to donate food, that liability question is so pervasive. Great. So we only have a few minutes left. So if we could just do any final takeaways, last things that you want to leave people with, any calls to action. Yeah, whoever wants to go first.
I'm happy to go for it and flag too that, I just came back from a big Hill Day fly-in event with the Zero Food Waste Coalition, where we were actually speaking with a number of different members of Congress about, the Food Day Labeling Act and wanting to get it passed. And so I think everyone tends to say, the big call to action is to reach out to your senators and your representatives, which sometimes can feel like, okay, well, how much impact is that gonna have? Like everyone always says to do that, like give me something else to do. But I firsthand hear in these conversations all the time, like, okay, well, what do my constituents think? Do you have any members that are in my jurisdiction? Or we're not gonna sign on to this because we haven't heard that from our members. And so I think like, it can seem a little bit like, okay, this is the same call to action, but it's because it's actually really impactful in terms of getting staffers and members to really consider it seriously for things like co-sponsoring it or just kind of supporting it when it comes to a vote.
This is a real squeaky wheel gets the grease situation.
Yeah,
Regina?
and I also wanted to say yes to everything that Tori just said. And when you're making those phone calls, save those numbers to your phone so you can call again and you have it, you don't have to keep Googling for it. And you can call for other areas, really, truly, once a week, once a month, call up. But also another call to action, Tori and I are sitting on another panel on April 4th, hosted by Climate Action Now. And it's a 60 minutes of you make direct action. And it's all around the Food Date Labeling Act and how we can save food in the face of a warming environment. So I definitely want to, invite folks to, come join that. They're really fun. And then also, as we said at the top of this conversation, please be sure to share this recording with your folks, because people maybe everyone's really busy, but you hear it a little bit, you hear it a little bit, you hear it a little bit, and then finally, someone's going to make that phone call, or you just never know when that saturation point will hit. So I just want to thank everyone in advance for sending it out to at least 3 other people. Can we say that?
Andrea?
I'll also add this. It's so rare in the environmental space that you have a topic that individual consumers have any control over. And this is one of those places where we do make a big impact. And so being that voice that says, use your senses, use some common sense around, like, your dried beans are going to be good for a very, very long time. Don't worry about what a date is on there. So learning about our food a little bit, trusting your senses, being the one to say, pretty sure that's a quality date. We don't have to throw it away. Let me taste it to see if my cereal is stale and if I'm still willing to eat it, is one of those ways we can go a long way of not tossing the food that's in our own home already and ensuring that other people understand how important it is for us to be valuing the food that we already have and all of the people who grew our food, all of the resources that went into creating it. And so I think that that's one of those places that we actually have quite a bit of personal ownership over being part of the solution.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you all for joining us today. Really appreciate it. And special thanks to our panelists and for PIRG for co-hosting this. Yeah, I hope everyone got something out of this. And as we said, there will be a recording. And I know Danielle posted a bunch of materials in the chat, and hopefully we can also send a follow-up email with those. I know it's a lot of different resources, but there's a lot of groups out there putting together great stuff to help educate people. So we really want to make sure that everyone has access to that. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Thank you, everyone.
Be safe. Peace and love.